The Blue Ridge Mountains do not care about your plans. They were old before this country had a name, old before the roads were cut through them, before the towns took root in the valleys between their ridges, before anyone thought to draw
You
a
dare
line on a map and
trespass here.
say,
Please, I meant no
this
harm.
side is
Your
ours,
fate is mine
that
to
side is
decide.
yours.
Mercy.
The mountains simply remained, patient, indifferent, covered in a forest so dense that in certain hollows noon looked like dusk, and dusk looked like the end of something. Ren Calloway had learned to love that quality, the indifference of it, the way the mountain asked nothing from you and offered everything, root and bark and leaf and stone, to whoever paid close enough attention. He had been paying attention since before dawn. He moved along the eastern slope of Harrow's Ridge the way he always moved in the early hours, slowly, deliberately, reading the ground the way other men read newspapers. The soil composition changed every 20 feet up here. Sandy loam gave way to clay-heavy earth near the old creek bend, and where the clay ran deep, the shade plants grew thick, ghost pipe, wild ginger, and if the drainage was exactly right, the pale stem clusters of shadow root that old Marin needed for her winter stock. He was crouched over a promising patch near a broken shelf of limestone when he heard it. A footstep, single, deliberate, not an animal, too even, too considered. He turned, still crouched, basket already half full with the morning's earlier harvest. She was standing on the path above him, 7 feet back, perfectly still. He put her at just under 6 feet, lean rather than broad, built like someone who moved fast across difficult ground. Her skin was a deep gray-green, the color of old moss on riverstone, and her hair was pulled back severely from a face that was doing the specific work of revealing nothing. Her eyes were amber, a shade that seemed to collect light rather than simply reflect it, as if something behind them burned slightly warmer than the surrounding air. She wore traveling clothes, well made. The leather worked with precision that had nothing to do with decoration and everything to do with function. But they were road dirty, slept in, more than once. She was not lost. She was not injured. She was standing there with the deliberate stillness of someone who had chosen this exact moment on this exact slope after thinking about it carefully. He would understand later that she had been thinking about it for 3 days. She looked at him the way you look at something you have been trying to identify from a distance and have finally gotten close enough to confirm. Then she spoke. "Survive my test, human." Her voice was low and even, not unkind, not warm, simply certain, the way a statement of fact is certain. 3 days. If you do, I'm yours. The morning held very still around them. Ren Calloway looked down at his herb basket, then back up at the orc woman blocking his view of the early sky. He felt the specific vertigo of a man whose ordinary Tuesday had just collapsed underneath him. He was afraid of her. He was honest enough with himself to admit that plainly. She was a stranger. She was visibly capable of doing him serious harm. She had said something that made no logical sense, but she had also been standing there with that look in her amber eyes. Contained, controlled, and underneath the control, something that had been waiting a long time to say exactly those words. Something that was not threat. Something that was, unless he was badly misreading the situation, far more like hope, and hope that was not entirely sure of itself. He recognized that look. It was the look of someone who had made a very difficult decision and needed the other person to simply say yes. He said yes. He was not entirely sure why, but he was honest enough later to understand that some part of him had moved toward her the same way it always moved toward suffering in any form. Before his mind finished deciding, before caution caught up, simply because something in him identified need and responded to it. He asked what the test was. Her eyes said she had been hoping he would ask that. Vora Stonecrest had been standing on that ridge for 11 minutes before she spoke. This was not hesitation. She did not hesitate. Hesitation implied uncertainty about what you wanted to do. What she had been experiencing was something different, a precise and unfamiliar reluctance to begin something that could not be taken back. She had been watching the man below her for 3 mornings. She had not planned to watch for 3 mornings. The first morning, she had stopped because something about the way he moved through the forest made her pause, and pausing had become watching, and watching had become something she did not have a clean word for yet. He moved like someone who had been paying attention for a very long time. Not carefully in the way of someone afraid of making mistakes. Carefully in the way of someone who genuinely respected what he was working with. Each plant he examined, he touched first with one finger before deciding whether to take it. He talked to himself sometimes, low and continuous, more like a running notation, thoughts being organized aloud. On the second morning, she had watched him find a plant he needed, growing on a ledge near the eastern drop where the limestone shelved out and the ground fell away on the north side. He could have reached it. The drop was real, but the risk was not large. He had the skill to manage it. She watched him stand at the edge for a full minute. He assessed it, and then he walked away and found another patch further along the ridge. Safer, less convenient. She had stood on the ridge above him for a long time after that, thinking. Most people, when they could reach something they wanted, reached for it. She had spent years surrounded by people who operated that way, not out of greed exactly, but out of the unexamined assumption that reach and take were the natural sequence of events. The willingness to look at what you wanted and walk away from it because the cost wasn't worth it. That quality was rarer than people believed, and it could not be performed. It either existed or it didn't. She had watched him 3 mornings before she understood what she was going to do. The test had existed in her mind since childhood. Her mother had described it once, an old tradition from the clan's earliest generations, from a time before political alliance had become the primary architecture of partnership. You set someone a challenge that revealed who they truly were. Not a performance, not an impression. If they met it honestly, they had earned the right to stand beside you. She had never expected to use it. She had, if she was being accurate, never expected to use it because she had never met anyone she wanted to stand beside on. She was 31 years old. She had spent those years becoming exactly what her father had needed her to become. Precise, capable, decisive, composed. She had earned the respect of the clan's warriors, the cautious trust of its advisors, the grudging acknowledgement of its rivals. She had led a battle command at 20, negotiated a trade agreement at 23 that still held, managed a drought response at 26 that kept 3 settlements fed through a winter that should have been catastrophic. She was, by any reasonable measure, exactly who the clan needed. She was also, by any honest internal accounting, profoundly alone. Not alone in the sense of being without people. She was surrounded always by people who needed things from her. The clan's inner circle was large and perpetually in motion, and she was its center, and she was so thoroughly surrounded by obligation and expectation and the continuous low-grade pressure of leadership that the loneliness inside all of it had taken years to even identify. It was not obvious from the outside. It was not obvious from the inside for a long time. It had taken losing 2 men to understand what kind of alone she was. The first, a warrior named Tovan, with a quiet laugh and a habit of noticing small things, had died in a border skirmish 3 weeks before their binding ceremony. She had grieved him formally, correctly, according to every tradition the clan held for loss. And then she had packed it away because there was no time. That was the truth she had never told anyone. She had packed it away in 3 days, and it had stayed packed because there was always something else that needed her attention. The second was a political match. When the alliance that necessitated it shifted, the arrangement ended. She had not grieved that one at all. She had felt relieved, and the relief had troubled her more than grief would have. Because it meant she had agreed to bind herself to a man whose loss she would not mourn, and she had done it because it was useful to the clan, and somewhere in the process of becoming exactly who the clan needed, she had lost track of the question of who she was when no one needed anything from her. She had been traveling south with a small escort, returning from a failed diplomatic meeting with the Dravian clan over border rights. The meeting had gone exactly as badly as she had expected. Dravan's leadership did not want agreement. They wanted delay while they consolidated their eastern flank. She had seen it within the first hour and spent 2 days being diplomatically patient about it anyway, because sometimes the process mattered even when the outcome was already written. When her guard captain received the emergency message from Stonecrest and she dismissed the escort to return, she had not felt the anxiety she should have felt about traveling alone through uncertain territory. She had felt something very close to relief. She had needed badly to be no one in particular for a few days. She had found the ridge above Harrow's Mill by following a tree line she had not explored before, and she had seen the man below and she had stopped. And on the third morning, she had finally come down. 3 days, she told him, standing on the path. You remain in your space, your routine, your life as it actually is. I will observe. I will participate. I will ask questions and expect honest answers. At the end of the third day, I will make my judgment. He was looking at her with the expression of a man trying to find the correct category for something that fit none of his existing ones. She added, you are not to perform, not to impress me, not to present a version of yourself you think I am looking for. She paused. I would know, he asked because he apparently could not think of anything else to say, where she intended to stay. She told him, wherever he offered. He stood there for a moment. Then he picked up his herb basket, checked the latch, and said, all right, come on then. She followed him down the slope. Ren Calloway had not always been the kind of man who accepted strange situations quietly. There had been a version of him years ago in Asheville who pushed back, who asked questions and expected answers and believed, with the particular stubbornness of the young, that the world owed him, at minimum, a coherent explanation for the things it did. He had grown up the son of a woman who sold cloth out of a shop on Lexington Avenue, and a father who had left before Ren was old enough to remember his face. Not a tragic childhood. His mother, Clara, practical and warm and possessed of a laugh that arrived without warning and filled whatever room she was in, had raised him with the competence of someone who had already made peace with doing everything herself. She never complained about it. She simply worked long days and came home tired and still found the energy to ask him what he had noticed that afternoon. What had he seen? What was he curious about? As if his attention to the world was the most important thing he could be developing. He had been 12 when the medicine woman on the other side of the neighborhood, an older woman named Darla, who kept a garden that smelled like the inside of an old library, had let him start watching her work. It was not an apprenticeship. She was too settled in her ways for formal teaching. But she let him observe, and observation was enough. He learned which plants grew where. He learned that most healing was not dramatic. It was patient and repetitive, and required the willingness to sit with someone while they hurt without trying to rush them through it. He turned out to be naturally good at that, unhurriedly good at it, the kind of goodness that does not announce itself. He had been 22 when his mother died. Fever, fast winter. He had done everything correctly, the right preparation, the right timing, the right herbs at the right doses. He had stayed beside her through 4 nights, watching for the turn. He knew what to watch for. He knew what it meant when the breathing changed. He understood, intellectually, that sometimes you did everything right and it still went the wrong way. He had understood that in his mind for years. Understanding it while sitting in the gray morning light beside a woman who had just stopped breathing was an entirely different kind of knowing. The kind that rearranges things internally and does not put them back in the same order. He stayed in Asheville another year, long enough to watch the woman he had been quietly, carefully, hopefully building something with. Lena, a blacksmith's daughter, practical and dark-haired and possessed of dry humor that caught you off guard, choose a structural engineer from Charlotte who could offer her a house with a real foundation and a future that did not depend on what happened to grow on hillsides. She was not cruel about it. She was honest. She told him she cared about him and she did not see a path, and she thought he deserved to know that clearly. He had thanked her, which surprised them both. He left 3 weeks later, not running, just going in the way you go when the place you're in has become mostly made of things you're trying not to think about. He found Harrow's Mill by accident, a wrong turn on a mountain road during a rainstorm that turned into a week's stay, which turned into a month, which turned into an introduction to Old Marin. She was 78, sharp as a new blade, and had been waiting, she told him without ceremony, for someone who knew how to handle plants without bruising them. That had been 6 years ago. His cottage sat at the edge of the mill district, technically a large shed that had been upgraded over decades by a series of pragmatic occupants. The roof held. The walls kept wind out. He had a hearth that drew well and shelves along every surface lined with dried bundles, bark strips, and small clay jars arranged in an order that made sense to him and no one else. The place smelled of earth and green things and faintly of wood smoke. He was not unhappy. That was the honest answer on most days. He had the hills and the work and the satisfaction of finding exactly the plant he needed in exactly the place he expected it to be. He had the mornings, which were his favorite part of any day. He had a good knife and a basket that balanced well on his shoulder, in the company of a woman who had spent 60 years accumulating knowledge he was genuinely glad to pass on. He did not have much else. He had stopped expecting much else. Which was perhaps why, when the orc woman appeared on the ridge above him, he did not immediately walk away. The cottage was smaller than she had expected. She had known it would be modest. She had watched him enter and leave it each morning from the ridge. But modest from a distance and modest from inside were different experiences. The single room was clean in the way of a person with limited space and extensive inventory who had developed precise systems for managing both. Every shelf was full, but nothing was crowded. Every jar and bundle had a location that was apparently non-negotiable. The hearth drew cleanly. The single window let in the morning light in a long rectangle that moved across the floor as the hours passed. There was one chair. She assessed it, assessed her own dimensions, and sat on the floor instead, back against the wall below the window. It was more comfortable anyway. She had always preferred the floor. He moved through the space with the careful awkwardness of a person trying to do familiar things while being watched. His hands, which she had observed over 3 mornings to be exceptionally steady and precise, were doing slightly incorrect things. He dropped his flint twice trying to start the fire. She did not comment on this. She watched. He made tea. It was clearly an automatic gesture, something he did when the social situation required a form and he had run out of other forms to offer. He brought her a cup with the simple politeness of a man who was not certain what the protocol was for any of this and was falling back on basic hospitality. She took it. She examined the color, brought it close enough to register the smell. Dried flowers, something root-based, faint mineral edge from the local water. She drank it slowly. He asked, because the silence had become something, whether she was hungry. She was. She had not eaten since the previous morning. She said nothing about this. He opened what he had: bread, dried fish, a handful of late-season apples, a soft cheese wrapped in cloth. He put it all on the table without ceremony, the way you put out food for someone you are not trying to impress, simply someone you are trying to ensure is fed. She ate with controlled economical movements. She was very hungry, and she was not going to let that be obvious. He ate his own portion without looking at her, the acknowledgement of a person's dignity done through deliberate inattention. She filed that away. It was the first thing she recorded. The days shaped themselves around the work, as days do when 2 people share a small space and there is something that needs doing regardless of the awkwardness between them. The second morning that they went out together at dawn, moving along the eastern ridge in the cold gray pre-light, he walked the way she had watched him walk from above, reading the ground, making small adjustments, stopping without announcement when something required closer examination. She kept pace without difficulty. He talked as he worked, not to fill silence, more like thinking aloud, a continuous low narration of what he was assessing and why. She listened carefully and asked questions. Good ones, precise ones, the kind that came from genuine interest rather than the performance of interest. What made one patch of moss useful and another useless when they looked identical from above? How he decided which roots to harvest and which to leave so the plant would recover. Whether his patterns were consistent across seasons or whether he recalibrated each time. He answered honestly, including the times the honest answer was, "Mostly I'm guessing and hoping the guess holds." She told him then the clan's groundwalkers worked differently. They harvested in cycles, entire patches at intervals calibrated to lunar timing, according to tradition passed down through generations. He considered this with the focused attention he brought to everything. Then he said, it probably worked well for common species, but might strain the rare ones beyond their recovery capacity. She thought about it, then said he was probably right. It was the first exchange that felt like a conversation rather than an assessment. That evening, she found herself doing something she had not planned. He had come back from washing his hands and found her with his knife in a whetstone, running the blade along the wet surface with practiced efficiency. He stood in the doorway for a moment. She did not look up. He said thank you. She handed the knife back and returned to her place by the wall. Later, while they sorted the day's harvest, he talking her through the categories, what was for pain, what was for fear, what needed drying versus pressing. She became aware of something she was doing without having decided to do it. She was humming, a low rhythmic sound, almost below the level of audible melody, the working song for sorting tasks, an old rhythm from before the clan's written records. You learned it so young it became part of the body's vocabulary, inseparable from working with your hands. She only realized she was doing it when she heard herself stop. He had noticed. He was looking at her with an expression that was carefully not too interested, giving her the option of pretending she had not been doing it. She said it was a clan tradition. Certain tasks had rhythms. She had not realized she was doing it. He asked if she would teach him. She looked at him. That considering pause she brought to real decisions. Then she hummed it again, slowly. He tried to follow, off by half a beat. The second measure slightly rushed. She tapped the table twice. He tried again and got it approximately right. She made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was something in that family, brief and unguarded, not assembled for an audience. That was the second thing she recorded. The second night she had the dream. She always had it when she was exhausted and her guard was down. The memory of the border skirmish, Tovon's face, the particular quality of morning light in that place, which she could not stop associating with the knowledge she had received an hour later. The dream never showed her the moment she was told. It only showed her the light. It was somehow worse that way. She woke with a word in her throat, a sharp orc word, bitten off before it fully formed. The cottage was dark. She lay still and rebuilt her breathing deliberately, the way she had trained herself, slow and even until the heart rate came down, until the room was just a room again, and the light was just darkness, and she was just herself, awake in a small human cottage in the Blue Ridge Mountains. He was awake. She could tell by the quality of the stillness of someone consciously not moving, not the loose quality of sleep. He did not speak. He did not ask if she was all right. He simply lay there in the dark and let her have the privacy of her own process. She regulated her breathing back to steadiness, then silence. In the morning there was a cup of tea on the table. She had not asked. He had not mentioned it. He was already looking at something else when she came out. His herb notes, spread beside the cup, his attention apparently fully occupied. The tea was pale, chamomile she identified, and something else, something root-based with a faintly bitter edge, a blend for difficult sleep. She had seen variations of it in groundwalker preparations. She looked at the cup. She looked at him. He did not look up. She sat down and drank it. That was the third thing. The third day was different. The awkwardness had gone. Not replaced by ease exactly, something more earned. A quality of attention between them that had stopped being about caution and started being about something else. He moved through the cottage with less consciousness of being watched. She moved with less consciousness of watching. She was simply present, in the way she was present in terrain she had learned. They were sitting by the fire that third evening, the work done, the cottage quiet, the light going amber and low when she asked him about his past, not intrusively, directly, the way she did everything. She said she had noticed he lived entirely without attachment to anything outside this valley, and she wanted to understand why. He told her, not everything, not the full architectural account of every loss, but the true version, the mother, the leaving, the smaller than expected life. He said it plainly, without self-pity, the way you describe something that happened long ago and has been examined enough times that it no longer cuts the way it once did. She was quiet for a while after. Then she said she understood that particular kind of tired, the kind that did not come from hardship, but from carrying weight that nobody around you could see. He looked at her then, really looked. Not the careful sideways attention he had been managing for 3 days, the practiced glance of someone trying not to stare at something unfamiliar. He looked at her directly. The fire had gone low. The amber light made her face look different than it had in the daylight. Less formal somehow, less composed. Behind the steadiness, behind the assessing calm she had maintained through 3 days of deliberate observation, there was something that was simply and straightforwardly sad. Not performed sadness, not communicated sadness, just the thing itself, visible for a moment in the quality of her silence. He did not ask what she meant. He thought he understood. They sat there until the fire went to coals, and neither of them moved to rebuild it, and the silence between them had stopped being the silence of two strangers navigating an unusual situation and become something else entirely, something that needed no explanation. She was going to have to say what she came to say in the morning. The 3 days were almost over. She had her judgment, had known it, in truth, since the second morning, though she had continued because she wanted to be certain, and because she was not ready for it to end. She went to sleep on the floor by the cold hearth, and for the first time in many nights, the dream did not come. The morning of the judgment came gray and cold. A thin rain had started before dawn, the quiet, persistent kind that turned the path outside to mud and made the forest smell of wet bark and something metallic, like stone after lightning. She was already awake when he rose, sitting by the dead fire, straight-backed, hands on her knees, wearing the expression she reserved for formal occasions. Not the testing calm of the past 3 days, not the unguarded face of the firelight the night before. Something more composed. Something that had put itself back together in the hours before dawn and knew what it needed to do. He started the fire without speaking and put water on. The morning routine had become familiar enough that they moved through it without collision. She stepped left when he needed the shelf. He passed her the cup without being asked. She moved to the table when he needed the hearthside. 3 days had made them oddly fluent in each other's space. When the tea was ready and they were both sitting, she told him the test was complete. She said he had done 3 things that mattered. He had fed her without making her feel like a burden. He had corrected her without making her feel inferior. And he had heard her pain without trying to fix it or minimize it or redirect it towards something more manageable. She said that by the reckoning of her clan's oldest tradition, these 3 things constituted the foundation of something worth having. Then she reached inside her collar and pulled out the cord around her neck. What she placed on the table between them was a seal, iron, black, thumb-sized, carved with an interlocking pattern that the eye kept trying to resolve into a single shape and could not quite manage. He looked at it. She watched his face. She saw the moment the pattern connected to something. Not because he was versed in Orc clan heraldry. She had never assumed he would be. She had watched him for 3 days. She had learned to read the small adjustments of his expression. She told him her name, her full name, Vora Stonecrest, daughter of Chieftain Aldrin Stonecrest of the Stonecrest clan, whose territory covered 3 mountain counties, whose standing force numbered 400 warriors, whose political weight in the region was not metaphorical. She told him she had been traveling for diplomatic purposes, that her escort had been recalled, that she had continued alone because she needed badly to be no one in particular for a few days. She told him she had found Harrow's Mill. She had found the ridge. She had found him. She watched him absorb all of it. Then he stood up. He said he needed some air. He walked outside into the rain and closed the door behind him with the careful quiet of a man who was controlling something. She sat at the table with her hands folded in her lap and the iron seal between them and listened to the rain on the roof and waited. She did not let herself think too specifically about what she would do if he did not come back through the door. Outside, she could hear his breathing settle. The door opened. He came back in. He sat down across from her. He looked at the seal on the table for a moment. Then he looked at her. He said he was not angry. He said he understood why she had done it the way she had done it. He said he needed her to understand that for him, the past 3 days had not been a performance. He had been entirely himself, without any awareness that it mattered in the way it apparently had. She said she knew. She said that was exactly why it mattered. They looked at each other across the small table, in the small cottage, with the rain coming down on the old tin roof, and the iron seal sitting between them like a period at the end of a sentence that neither of them had known they were writing. Then came the sound of horses on the valley road. Multiple, moving fast, then voices, then a knock on the door, hard and official, in the way of people accustomed to doors opening before they finished knocking. The morning, it turned out, was not finished with them yet. Ren opened the door. 3 orc warriors stood in the rain, armored, serious, road wet from hard riding. The one at the front was a woman, stocky, somewhere in her mid-30s, with the bearing of someone who had spent years being the most capable person in difficult rooms and had long since stopped being modest about it. She was looking past Ren before he had fully registered her face. She was looking at Vora. The expression on her face was the expression of a person who has been genuinely, deeply worried and is now experiencing relief so intense it is converting itself in real time visibly into controlled anger. Ren stepped aside. The warrior entered without being invited. Her two companions remained at the door, hands loose at their sides, watching the tree line with the automatic vigilance of people paid to watch tree lines. The woman spoke in Orc, rapid, clipped, the vowels compressed with urgency. Her name, Ren would learn later, was Haska, Vora's guard captain. She had been riding for 18 hours. Vora stood. The transformation was instantaneous and complete. The woman who had been sitting at his table with folded hands and an iron seal between them, the woman who had moments before been waiting with something that looked very much like vulnerability, was simply gone. In her place was someone else, not a different person. A larger version of the same person, the way a river looks different at its widest point than moving through a narrow channel. She answered in Orc. Her tone left no space for the conversation to go anywhere. She did not direct it. They spoke for several exchanges. Ren understood none of the words, but he understood cadence, and the particular way a person's body changes when receiving bad news and refusing to let it show. Then Vora turned to him. She said, there is a problem. The problem had arrived in Harrow's Mill before dawn. A single rider from the Dravon clan, the clan whose leadership Vora had just spent 2 days diplomatically enduring, had come into the valley while it was still dark and had been working the town quietly ever since. Haska told it plainly, in the common tongue now, for Ren's benefit as much as Vora's. The rider was not a messenger, he was an operative. There was a difference. He had spent the early morning hours moving through the town's gathering places, the feed store, the mill yard, the covered porch of the hardware shop where the older men collected in bad weather, and he had been talking, carefully, without urgency, the way you plant something when you want it to grow on its own. His version of events, the Stonecrest chieftain's daughter had been traveling alone, without escort, and had spent 3 days in a human man's home, unaccounted for, unchaperoned, with no witnesses to what had occurred. He never called it anything directly. He did not need to. Direct accusations could be refuted. What he was distributing was something more difficult. The raised eyebrow, the pause that carried implication, the careful repetition of facts that individually were innocuous and together pointed somewhere he never pointed at himself. Vora was very still while Haska spoke. Then Haska said the thing that mattered most, the part Vora had clearly already understood before it was finished. The Dravon clan had been at the negotiating table last week because the region's border authority required it, not because they wanted agreement. What Haska had learned in the past 12 hours was that Dravon's leadership had known about Vora's solo travel before it happened. They had known, and they had planned around it. If Vora's credibility as a future clan leader was undermined, if the story spread that the chieftain's heir had behaved in ways that called her judgment into question, then the border negotiations would have to restart, with someone more uncertain, someone whose position was weaker, someone who needed the agreement more than Dravon did. This was not a scandal about 3 days in a mountain cottage. This was a political maneuver, 3 weeks in the making, and someone had told them she was traveling alone. Someone inside Stonecrest. Vora said nothing for a long moment after Haska finished. The rain came down on the roof. The fire Ren had built that morning burned steadily, and the cottage smelled the way it always smelled, earth and green things and wood smoke, and everything in it was exactly where it had been an hour ago, and nothing was the same. Then Ren said, I'm going to the square. Vora turned to look at him. This is not your concern, she said. Not unkindly, the tone of someone trying to be fair about the limits of responsibility. Ren picked up his coat from the hook by the door. My name is in the story, he said. My house. 3 days of my actual life. If someone is telling a version of those 3 days in the center of my town, I'm going to be there for it. She looked at him for a moment. Something crossed her face that he did not have a name for yet. Then she said, Stay close. The square in Harrow's Mill was not large. It was the intersection of 2 county roads, widened slightly by common use over generations, with a war memorial on one corner and a gas station on the other, and a covered pavilion in the middle that served for farmers' markets in summer, and nothing in particular the rest of the year. In rain, it had the gray quality of a place where something is about to happen. The Dravon operative was already there. He was a lean man, Orc, perhaps 40, with the look of someone very comfortable with his own intelligence. He had gathered an audience without appearing to gather one, simply by being interesting in a place where people had nothing else to look at. A loose circle of Harrow's Mill residents stood in the shelter of the pavilion's overhang, wearing the cautious, watchful expression of people who were not sure what they were witnessing, but had decided it was worth staying for. At the edge of the group, wrapped in a heavy coat she had clearly thrown on quickly, stood old Marin. She was watching the operative with an expression Ren could not immediately read. The operative saw Vora when she entered the square. His posture changed slightly, the adjustment of a man who has just recognized that the game has entered its next phase. He addressed the assembled residents, not loudly, conversationally, the way a man who understood acoustics worked a covered space. He laid out his version of events with the smooth, regretful tone of someone reluctantly sharing concerns they would rather not have to raise. The facts were accurate. That was what made it effective. Vora Stonecrest, daughter of Chieftain Aldrin Stonecrest, had been traveling without escort. Her guard had been dismissed. She had spent 3 nights in the home of a human resident of Harrow's Mill. No witnesses, no formal record. An arrangement that, whatever its innocent nature, had the appearance of something a future clan leader ought not to have allowed. He paused in the way of someone allowing implications to settle on their own. Questions of character, he said, with practiced gentleness, matter when we consider who will be making decisions that affect all of us. Ren was aware of Vora beside him. He could feel the quality of her stillness, the effort it was taking. He stepped forward, not dramatically. He did not raise his voice. He simply moved into the open space of the pavilion where the acoustics were better and turned to face the residents rather than the operative. I can tell you what happened, he said, if that's useful. The circle adjusted. People do when someone unexpected begins to speak. He described the past 3 days, the herb harvest on the eastern ridge. Coming back to the cottage, the bread and dried fish and late-season apples laid out on the table. The work of sorting the day's collection in the evening, what was for pain, what was for fever, what needed drying and what needed pressing. The early mornings on the ridge, walking the same ground he walked every morning, gathering the same plants with the same methods he had been using for 6 years, with someone alongside him asking questions he had found, if he was honest, genuinely good. He described the chamomile tea. The way the fire had burned low on the 3rd evening, and neither of them had moved to rebuild it. The morning routine that had sorted itself out over 3 days, who stepped left, who stepped right, whose cup was whose. He said it all in the plain, specific language of someone reporting actual events. No interpretation, no argument, no performance of injured dignity, just what had happened, in order. When he finished, he said, if the question is whether Vora Stonecrest conducted herself with honor during 3 days in Harrow's Mill, I can answer that without hesitation. More thoroughly and more consistently than most people I have encountered in my life. The pavilion was quiet. The operative began to respond. Vora spoke over him in the common tongue, clearly and evenly. She confirmed what Ren had described. She named the tradition, the old partnering rite, used by her clan's founders to determine character through observation rather than political negotiation. She said the test had been conducted honestly, and its result was her own private business. She said anyone who wished to contest the nature of those 3 days was welcome to do so formally, before her father's council, with the full weight of clan law governing what was said and what could be proven. She let that land. The operative had come to Harrow's Mill prepared for scandal. He had not come prepared for transparency. He gathered himself to leave, and in the moment before he turned, he stepped close to Vora, close enough that the words were for her alone. He said very quietly, "Your father will not live to see spring." He said it with the precision of someone who had been given information and had chosen to use it as a weapon rather than a warning. He did not clarify how he knew. He did not need to. The implication was sufficient. Someone inside Stonecrest had been talking, and not merely about travel arrangements. Vora's face did not change. She held his gaze for exactly 2 seconds. Then she let him look away first. He left. The square dispersed slowly. Residents drifted back toward their errands, carrying the slightly stunned expression of people who had witnessed something they had not expected and were not yet sure what to make of it. Ren stood in the pavilion and felt the rain lighten slightly. He became aware of old Marin at his elbow. She was looking at him with an expression he had not seen from her before. Not approval exactly, something more considered than that. The look of a person who has been watching something develop at a long distance and is now watching it arrive at the place it was always going. She pressed a bundle into his hands, dried material he had not seen her prepare. Specific plants, specific combinations, wrapped the way she wrapped things she considered important. She said, 6 years I watched you spend your stamina on a life too small to need it. She held his gaze steadily. Go find out what a large one feels like. Then she turned and walked back toward her house without another word. Ren watched her go and stood with the bundle in his hands and understood, from the way she had said it, that she had not been surprised by any of this. Not by Vora, not by the test, not by what came next. He would think about that later. They walked back to the cottage without speaking. Haska's two companions fell in behind them at a respectful distance, close enough to be present, far enough to give the illusion of privacy. Inside, the fire had burned down to coals. Ren added wood. The familiar small actions of tending a fire, while everything around them waited for the next thing. Vora stood at the window. Her back was to the room. Outside, the rain was thinning. The Blue Ridge reasserted itself through the gray. Those patient shapes in the distance, green and dark, watching as they had always watched. She said without turning, "You did not have to do that." "I know." It created a visible association between us, in front of witnesses. A pause. "That will follow you." "I know that too." She turned. She looked at him across the small room, across the space that 3 days had made familiar, and this morning had made complicated. And something in her expression was doing the thing it had done by the fire the night before, the small, visible gap in the composure. She said, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to understand that your answer does not obligate you to anything. No part of what has happened over these 3 days creates an obligation in either direction." He waited. She said, "I want you to come with me." The room held still. She said it the way she said everything, directly without softening the edges. She used the word her clan used. The closest translation in English was something like chosen partner. But the weight behind it, the full specific gravity of what the tradition meant and what it asked, did not survive translation intact. She said it meant standing beside her, being part of her household and her world, having standing in the clan structure, being someone whose opinion she valued and whose presence she wanted. She said she knew what she was asking. She knew what his world was, this cottage, this valley, these mornings on the ridge, and she was asking him to leave it. She said she would understand if he refused. She said she would not hold the refusal against him. She said she was asking because she wanted to ask, not because the tradition required it, not because she felt she owed him something. The test had been her idea and her choice. The asking was also her choice. Then she stopped talking and waited. Ren looked at the shelves. The jars lined up in their order. The dried bundles hung from the ceiling in the arrangement he had developed over 6 years. The oiled cloth over the window, the single chair, the flint he had dropped twice that morning. He said, "I'm afraid." She said, "I know." He said, "I'll be wrong about everything constantly. I'll misread customs and offend people and need things explained to me that everyone around me considers obvious. Every day I'll be the one who doesn't belong, and I don't know if I have." He stopped, looking for the right word. The stamina for that. She was quiet for a moment, then she said, "Yesterday, in the square, you stood in the mud in front of your neighbors and described 3 days honestly, knowing that honesty was going to complicate your life regardless of how it was received." He said nothing. "You chose the difficult thing," she said, "because it was the right thing. I watched you do it. I watched you do smaller versions of it for 3 days before that." She paused. "I don't think you lack stamina. I think you have been spending it on a life that was not large enough to need it." The rain had almost stopped. Through the oiled cloth, the light was beginning to change, the flat gray lifting, the blue-green of the mountains beginning to reassert themselves, everything looking as if it had just been washed and set out to dry. He said, "I'm not interested in your territory or your title. Whatever I'm saying yes to, it's not those things." She said, "I know that too." He said, "I'm interested in you. The person who sat across from me for 3 days and asked real questions and learned the working rhythm and drank the chamomile tea and told me she understood being tired in a way no one around her could see. He looked at her. That's what I'm saying yes to. She was very still. Her amber eyes were doing something he did not have a name for yet. Something that was not the assessing attention of the test, not the composure of the clan leader. Something more direct than either of those things, and more personal, like a door that had been closed for a long time, opening on well-oiled hinges. She held out her hand, not the formal gesture she had used in the square. Something simpler, something private, the kind of gesture that needs no witnesses and carries its meaning in the fact that it is offered at all. He took it. They stood in the cottage doorway while the last of the rain moved east along the ridge, and neither of them said anything else for a while, and it was not nothing. They left Harrow's Mill the following morning. Wren had packed the night before, not much it turned out. 6 years in one place, and the things that mattered fit into a single pack and 2 canvas bags. He had stood in the middle of the cottage for a while, looking at the shelves, and then he had taken the 3 clay jars that old Marin had given him last winter, the ones that always went back in the same spot, in the same order, and wrapped them carefully in cloth and put them in the pack. He had gone to see old Marin before dark. She had been in her kitchen when he knocked, which she always was at that hour. He showed her the pack on his shoulder. She looked at it, then at him, and handed him the bundle she had already prepared. The same one from the square, he realized. She had made it before the morning's events. She had known he was coming. He asked her how she had known. She said she had known his mother. Not well, but enough. And that some things had a recognizable shape when you had been paying attention long enough. He had stood on her porch in the gathering dark for a long moment, holding the bundle and thinking about all the things that had been true long before he knew they were true. Then he had walked back to the cottage and finished packing. The journey to Stonecrest took 8 days. The horses were Haska's. Wren could ride, had learned years ago, maintained the skill at a functional level. But functional and the pace Haska set were not precisely the same standard. He fell slightly behind on the first morning and adjusted, and by the 3rd day was managing it without spending all his attention on the management. Haska briefed him on protocols the first evening with the brisk efficiency of someone who had decided he required management and had taken the responsibility upon herself. Addressed by rank before name in formal context. Never turn your back to the entrance in a gathering space. The correct angle of the head when acknowledging a senior clan member. Not a bow, different from that, a specific tilt that communicated deference without submission. The difference between a working silence and an insulted silence and how to tell them apart. The foods offered to guests for ceremony versus the foods offered because someone was hungry, and why it mattered which category you were eating from. She covered it efficiently, without embellishment, and looked at him after each item with the expectant expression of a woman waiting to be told she needed to repeat herself. She never needed to repeat herself. On the 2nd day, she told him, with the matter-of-fact tone she brought to every observation, "You pay attention well. Most people don't, actually." He said he had been told that before. She said, "By who?" He said, "My mother, mostly." Something in Haska's expression shifted slightly, almost imperceptibly, towards something that was not quite warmth but was in that direction. She did not bring it up again. He worked at the language in every spare moment. Vora corrected him without impatience. The correction as information rather than judgment. The same way she had corrected his working rhythm in the cottage, a tap on the table. Try again. By the 4th day, he had approximately 40 reliable words and could follow simple exchanges if people spoke slowly. On the 4th evening, he used a word at the wrong moment. The agreement sound, the short exhale through the nose, that meant, yes, I already knew that, but I appreciate you said it. He used it in response to something Haska said that was not remotely that kind of statement. There was a silence. Then Vora made a sound, the same surprised, unguarded sound she had made in the cottage when he had gotten the working rhythm approximately right, the one that was not quite a laugh, but was something in that family. Haska looked between them with the expression of a person witnessing something she had not been briefed on. The 5th day began with normal rhythms. They had been following a ridge road through old hardwood forest, chestnuts and oaks whose canopies blocked the sky, the undergrowth thick with fall ferns and the deep humus of accumulated decades. The air at this elevation smelled of cold and bark and something mineral from the exposed granite shelves along the eastern face. Ren was watching the forest alongside the road. Different territory from what he knew. Different species distribution, different soil signatures in the plant communities. He had noticed the harvested patches they occasionally rode past, the specific signature of time cycle clearing, and had been filing observations since the third day. He was cataloging a plant assemblage near a wet outcropping when Haska dropped back from the head of the column without ceremony and said, "The chieftain lost consciousness again this morning." And the column moved on without breaking pace. Ren looked forward. Vora was at the lead, still riding, posture unchanged. She had already heard. Haska had told her first. He was watching the moment after the news, the period when the body decides how much of what it just received to let show. Her back was straight. Her hands on the reins were steady. Neither of those things told him anything about what was happening behind them. "It is the second time in 2 months," Haska said, not exactly to him, more to the air between them. "Each time the recovery is slower." She paused. She has known this was coming. She has been preparing. But knowing something is coming and having it arrive are not the same experience. Ren said, "No, they're not." Haska looked at him briefly. She said, "There is a faction in the clan council that has been waiting for an opportunity to challenge her succession formally. They will use the chieftain's declining health as the occasion. They will also note that she returns from a diplomatic failure with a human she intends to install in her household, and they will note it loudly." A pause. "They will have supporters, not a majority, but enough to create noise." Ren absorbed this. He said, "You're telling me this so I understand what I'm riding toward." "I'm telling you," Haska said, with the flat directness of someone who had decided to respect him enough to be honest. "So that you understand she cannot afford to appear uncertain. She will not be uncertain. She does not do that. But she is carrying something significant today, and she carries these things alone because it is how she is built." Ren said nothing. She said, "It would be useful if someone understood that without being told." She returned to the front of the column without further comment. They made camp that evening in a hollow below a granite outcropping. The horses were tended, the fire built, the evening meal prepared with the efficiency of a group that had done this many times. Vora ate with the others and spoke when addressed and managed the camp's logistics with the automatic competence she brought to everything. She was fully functional and entirely present and completely sealed. After the camp quieted and the watch rotation began, Ren got up from his bedroll and walked to the far edge of the firelight, where the rock face made a partial shelter. He sat on a flat stone and looked at the forest. He had been there perhaps 10 minutes when he heard her approach. She came around the edge of the outcropping and saw him and stopped. He did not say anything. She sat down on the rock beside him. The fire was visible from here as a warm suggestion in the distance. Above the tree line, the sky was extraordinarily clear. The stars, the kind of dense, unobstructed stars that only appeared at real elevation, far from any town's light. She unfolded the territory map she had been carrying and spread it across her knees, the act of someone who needed her hands to be doing something. He could see the long ridge system that formed the natural border. He could see where it was ambiguous. He could see there was a great deal to protect. He looked at her face. She was studying the map with focused attention, but the focus had a different quality tonight. Harder, like concentration being used for something other than what it was pretending to be used for. Like a woman keeping herself busy because busyness was what she had instead of someone to talk to. She had been doing this her whole adult life. He could see it now. The posture was correct, controlled, and also in a way he was only beginning to see because he had spent 3 days watching her when her guard was slightly lower, exhausted. The kind of exhausted that has been managed so long it has become invisible to everyone around it, including sometimes the person carrying it. He did not ask what she was thinking. He did not offer anything that required her to manage her response to it. He simply sat there, beside her. In the cold, under the dense mountain stars, the map rustled slightly in a small wind. After a long time, she said without looking up, "He has been refusing to acknowledge the decline. For 2 years, he has been making decisions as if the illness was temporary. I have been managing what I could without overstepping the authority he still held, formally." A pause. "I knew this was where it was going. I knew it months ago." Ren said nothing. Knowing the direction of something, she said, is not the same as arriving at its destination. She folded the map. Precise movements, each crease deliberate. I am not afraid of the work, she said. I have been doing the work. I am ready for the work. She stopped. Something in her voice had moved, almost imperceptibly, but it was there. I am tired of doing it alone. The wind moved through the trees above them. Wren said, "You're not alone tonight." She was quiet for a long moment. Then she looked at him. In the faint light from the distant fire, her amber eyes were doing the same thing they had done in the cottage on the third evening. That openness, the face that appeared when she was not performing anything, when the composure was present but the person behind it was also visible. They sat there until the wind picked up and the fire burned lower, and somewhere up the ridge an owl called once and went silent. He was aware of the miles still ahead, of the council room and the warriors who had already formed opinions, and the rival who had already decided what he intended to do about Wren's presence. He was aware of all of it. He found, sitting on a cold rock under an impossible number of stars, that the awareness did not resolve into fear. It resolved into something more like readiness. Not the readiness of someone who knew what was coming. The readiness of someone who had decided clearly, without the last trace of reservation, to find out. He had made his choice in the cottage doorway in the rain. He was making it again here on a rock in the cold, with no witnesses and no ceremony. He was making it the way all real choices are made, not once, but over and over, in the ordinary moments when the large decision meets the small daily fact of itself. They would arrive at Stonecrest in 3 more days. He was ready. Stonecrest did not announce itself. There was no gate, no wall, no single moment where the forest ended and the settlement began. It arrived the way mountains arrived, gradually and then all at once. First the trails widened, packed harder by generations of use. Then the stumps appeared at the tree line, old growth cleared decades back, the new timber allowed to reach only so high before being managed back. Then the smell changed. Wood smoke and worked metal, and the density of a place where many people lived in close proximity to animals and earth and each other. Then the buildings, stone mostly, low and wide, built into the slope rather than placed on top of it, not fighting the terrain but working with it, finding the natural shelves and hollows and using them. The population moved with the purposeful, unhurried energy of a community that had its own rhythms and was not adjusting them for visitors. They looked at him. He had expected that. What he had not entirely anticipated was the range. Some were openly curious, the frank staring of people who had not seen many humans up close and were not embarrassed about looking. Some were skeptical, arms folded, waiting to be proven right about something they had already decided. A few were actively cold, turning away when Vora brought him into communal spaces, their disapproval communicated through the careful architecture of their inattention. And there were very few, fewer than the others, but present, who watched with something quiet and considering. The look of people who had been wondering whether something was possible and had decided to observe rather than conclude. Wren cataloged all of it. He had been paying attention his whole life. He paid attention now. The council convened 2 days after their arrival. Vora told him the night before, matter-of-factly, that he would be present. She said it in the tone she used for accurate statements, flat, certain, leaving no structural space for the conversation to go anywhere other than forward. He asked what to expect. She said, "Elder Gren will ask you a direct question. Answer it directly. Do not apologize for being present. Do not explain yourself before you are asked to explain yourself." She paused. Ysel will not speak until she has something worth saying. When she speaks, listen carefully. She says approximately a third of what she thinks, which means every word she chooses is doing significant work. She had looked at him with the amber focus he had spent 8 days on the road learning to read more precisely. Be exactly who you are, she said, nothing more and nothing less. He had slept, remarkably without difficulty. The council room was stone-walled and low-lit, the light coming from iron fixtures along the walls that burned with a steady, oil-fed glow. A long table, 5 chairs on one side occupied, a single chair on the other, for him. Vora sat at the end of the table, not quite with either side, which was its own kind of statement about where her authority sat in relation to the council's. Elder Gren was the oldest person Wren had seen in Stonecrest. He had the look of someone who had survived by being willing to say the things others walked around. His face was deeply lined, and his eyes were a pale gray that seemed to be doing continuous, patient arithmetic on everything they rested on. He waited until everyone had settled. Then he looked at Ren directly and said, "My concern is not your character." Ren said nothing. He had been told to wait for the question. "I have heard the account of the test," Gren said. "I have no objection to you as an individual. My concern is what your presence here means for this clan." He folded his hands on the table. "Vora Stonecrest is the future leadership of Stonecrest. Her decisions, her household, her public associations, these are not only her private business. Her stability is the clan's stability. Her credibility is the clan's credibility." He paused. "What do you offer specifically that serves the interests of this community?" The room was very quiet. Ren thought about the harvested patches they had ridden past on the road, the specific signature of the time cycle clearing, the slow recovery species he had been turning over in his mind since the third day of the journey. He said, "I'm a herbalist, 15 years of working medicinal plants in Appalachian terrain. I've been making mental notes since we crossed into Stonecrest territory 3 days ago." He looked at Gren steadily. "Your groundwalkers use a time cycle harvest rotation. For common species, it works. For the rare ones, the slow-growing ones that need specific drainage and shade conditions that take decades to establish, I believe you're clearing faster than the plants can recover." He paused. "I would be glad to have that conversation with your groundwalkers, if they're interested. I'm not here to tell them they're wrong. I'm here to share a different set of observations from a different set of years." A beat of silence. Gren said, "Most people in your position would have spoken about loyalty or love." Ren said, "Those things are also true, but you asked a practical question, and I answered that question. I can speak to the other things directly if you want them separately." At the far end of the council, a woman who had not yet spoken made a sound, short, exhaled through the nose, a sound Ren had heard before, on the road, in the cottage, in moments when things clicked into place. He recognized it now. Esau was perhaps 50, with the careful stillness of someone who had learned that most conversations resolved themselves if you waited long enough. She had not moved since the session began, but she had made the sound. He did not smile. The moment was not right for smiling, but something in his chest settled. The way things settle when a diagnosis turns out to be correct. When the plant you expected to find is exactly where you expected it. Gren looked at Isel. Isel said nothing further, but she unfolded her hands on the table, which was apparently sufficient. Chieftain Aldrin Stonecrest died on the 43rd day after their arrival, quietly in the early morning, with Vora beside him. She came to find Ren afterward. Not immediately, she had things to do first. The formal things, the required things. The long sequence of acknowledgments that the clan's tradition demanded of the person who was now, officially and completely, its leader. She did all of them, correctly, without visible difficulty. She found him in the space that had been cleared for the herb garden, along the south wall of the inner settlement in the late afternoon. She sat on the low stone edging beside the shadow root bed and did not say anything for a long time. He did not ask. Eventually she said, "He knew at the end. He had known for longer than he let me see." She paused. "He was protecting me from it, in his way." Ren said nothing. "It was the wrong way," she said, "but I understand why." They sat there until the light went off the mountains. 3 weeks later, the matter of the informant resolved itself with less drama than its weight deserved. A junior aide from the escort, recruited by Dravan's network 2 years prior, who had calculated incorrectly that Vora's position was weakening and had placed his bet accordingly, was identified through a methodical review of who had known the escort's route. He was dealt with according to clan law. Vora handled it herself, formally, without anger, which was somehow more final than anger would have been. She told Ren about it that evening, plainly and without embellishment. He said, "Are you all right?" She said, "Yes." Then, "It is the kind of thing that is always all right and never entirely all right. Both things are true." He recognized the logic. He had used it himself. Elder Gren had proposed the formal recognition of their partnership on the same morning that Stonecrest's official response to the Dravan border claim was delivered. A document that closed the dispute with the finality that only comes from a leader whose position is unambiguous, and whose house is in order. The timing was not accidental. Isel had arranged it. She did not mention this to anyone. Drave came on the fourth day after the council. Wren had been aware of him before they met directly. You could not move through Stonecrest without becoming aware of Drave, not because he was loud or aggressive, but because of the gravity he generated in rooms. The way conversations reorganized slightly when he entered. The way people's attention moved toward him with the involuntary quality of iron approaching a magnet. He was large even by the standards of Stonecrest, broadly built, with the musculature of someone who had spent his entire adult life doing work that built that kind of body. His face was composed and confident in the way of someone who had never seriously had to doubt his position in any room he occupied. He had, Haska told Wren quietly and precisely, expected to be standing where Wren was standing. Not because he loved Vora, Haska was specific about that. He had looked at her and seen the most significant thing available, and acquiring significant things was the architecture of how he understood his own life. He had been doing it successfully for 33 years. He issued the formal challenge on the fourth morning in the common space outside the main hall, in front of whatever witnesses happened to be present, which turned out to be a considerable number, because significant things move through small communities with considerable speed. The tradition was specific. Haska had covered it on the road. The challenger named the category of contest. The challenged had the right to name the form within that category. Drave named demonstration of worth. His tone carried the assumption of physical contest. Not explicit, the tradition allowed for other forms, but the assumption was present in the way he stood, the slight forward weight that was the body's advertisement of its own confidence. Wren said, herbalism knowledge. The silence that followed had a specific texture. Drave's expression moved through surprise to recalibration to the face of someone determining whether they have been outmaneuvered and has not yet concluded. Haska produced 3 plant specimens. She had been carrying them. She had prepared this, or prepared for it as one of several possibilities, and had said nothing to him because she had determined that knowing in advance would change how he performed. He made a note to tell her later that she was very good at her job. The first plant was bloodroot, white spring, ephemeral, widespread through Appalachian hardwood forest, unmistakable to anyone with basic plant knowledge. Wren identified it, described its uses, noted the preparation methods, and the specific cautions around dosage. Drave identified it too, correct. Incomplete on the preparation nuances, but correct. The second was black cohosh, again widespread, again identifiable. Wren described the root preparation, the specific harvesting window, the way the potency changed depending on whether the plant was harvested in its 3rd year or its 5th. Drave identified it, called it by the clan's name, which was different but clearly the same plant. The 3rd specimen was something Wren had not seen before. He picked it up and looked at it for a long time without speaking. The crowd, which had been murmuring through the first 2 identifications, went quiet. The plant was small, a ground-level species, with a specific pattern of leaf venation he had not encountered in the Blue Ridge terrain he knew. The stem had a faint reddish cast where it met the soil. The underside of the leaves had a texture, slightly rough and almost granular, that was distinctive. There was a smell, faint but present, when he bruised a leaf edge, something between mineral and green, something that suggested alkaline soil preference and shade tolerance in a specific relationship with old-growth fungal networks. He had never seen this plant, but he knew what it was doing in the ecosystem. He could read that. He said, I don't know this one specifically. It doesn't grow in the terrain I know. He turned it slowly in his hands. Based on the venation pattern and stem coloration, I'd put it in the same family as the plants used for inflammation and mild pain response in this region. The leaf texture suggests it prefers alkaline soil, which means it's probably associated with the limestone shelves on your north slope. The smell when bruised, there's a bitter alkaloid there, which means preparation matters. I'd treat it the way I'd treat anything in that family. Cautious dosage, never raw, test for sensitivity before wide use. He set it down carefully. I'm estimating, I could be wrong on the specifics. I would want to know if I am. The crowd was completely still. The admission of limitation offered plainly, without embarrassment, in the same sentence as the demonstrated knowledge. landed differently than a confident answer would have. It was the stance of someone who had learned long ago that knowing the edges of your knowledge was as important as the knowledge itself, maybe more. Haska exhaled through her nose. The sound moved through the crowd like something softening. Not a ripple exactly, more like the way frost thaws, gradually and then completely, the transformation visible only once it had already occurred. Several other people made the sound. Drave looked at the plant on the table between them. He had not identified it at all. He stood there for a moment in the process of recalibrating a map of himself that had not needed recalibrating before, and found the process unpleasant, and was managing that unpleasantness with the limited tools available to someone who had not previously needed to develop them. Then he left, not gracefully, but he left. Ren stood in the common space while the witnesses dispersed and thought about the third plant, which was still on the table, and thought that he genuinely wanted to know what it was and what he had gotten right and what he had gotten wrong. He picked it up and put it in his pocket. He would ask the groundwalkers. The groundwalkers were three. An older man named Fern, who had been doing the work for 40 years and had the suspicion of someone who had been doing something successfully for a long time and had recently been told there might be a different way. A younger woman named Sovi, Fern's apprentice, who had the barely concealed intellectual hunger of someone who had been given good instruction and was beginning to sense its limits. And a middle-aged man named Called, who said almost nothing but watched everything, and whose silence was not absence but a different form of presence. They met 3 days after the council session, in the groundwalkers' workroom at Fern's invitation, which had been delivered with the slightly reluctant tone of an invitation extended because it was the correct thing rather than the desired thing. Ren brought the unknown plant. He asked Fern what it was before he said anything else. Fern told him the clan name, the properties, the preparation method, the harvesting tradition. Ren listened carefully, then said where he had gotten close and where he had been wrong. The alkaloid he had identified was real, but the preparation method he had assumed differed from the actual one. He had been correct about the soil preference, incorrect about the fungal association. Fern looked at him with slightly less suspicion than he had 5 minutes earlier. Sovi asked how he had identified it partially without knowing it. Ren said, pattern recognition. You learn enough plants thoroughly enough, you stop seeing individual species and start seeing signatures. After a while, the signatures are more informative than the names. Sovi wrote that down. Fern watched her write it down with the expression of a man trying to determine how he felt about his apprentice, writing down things said by an outsider, and arriving slowly at something approaching equanimity. They talked for 3 hours. By the end of it, Ren had shared what he knew about slow recovery species and the indicators that distinguish sustainable harvest pressure from depletion. Fern had shared the lunar cycle logic behind the clan's timing tradition, which had more observational basis than Ren had assumed and addressed variables he had not fully considered. Neither of them had convinced the other of everything. Both of them had learned something. Sovi had filled 4 pages. Called, who had said 11 words in 3 hours, said on the way out, "Come back Thursday," then walked away without waiting for an answer. Fern, not looking at Ren, said, "He doesn't say that to most people." Ren said he would come back Thursday. 3 weeks into Stonecrest, he sat outside the small stone workroom Viral had given him on the first day, a room along the south wall previously used for storage that he was gradually filling with drying bundles and sorted jars and the organized density of a working space finding its shape. The mountains were white above the settlement. The first snow had come overnight, the dry, powdery kind that caught on the north faces of the stone buildings and made the whole settlement look like something drawn rather than built. He sat on the cold step and looked at the mountain range and felt the distance from Harrow's Mill with a clarity that had nothing to do with regret and everything to do with honest accounting. He would never again be the man in the cottage whose mornings were only his. He would never again be someone whose days moved through their hours without consequence, without being watched, without mattering to the structure of something larger than himself. That life was not waiting for him. It had concluded, and he had concluded it, and there was nothing about that conclusion he would change. But the absence of regret did not mean the absence of loss. Both things were true. He was learning that both things were allowed to be true simultaneously. He heard her footsteps on the stone path. Even now, she moved the way she had always moved, efficient and even, a particular quality of footfall that distributed weight thoughtfully even when she was not thinking about it. He had learned to identify her by that sound, specifically among all the sounds of Stonecrest he was still learning to read. She came around the corner of the workroom and saw him on the step. She sat down beside him without asking, something she had done from the first days in the cottage and had never stopped. He said, "I'll never have days that are only mine again." She was quiet. "That's not a complaint," he said. "I want to be precise about that. I'm not building toward a departure. I'm not trying to tell you I've made a mistake. I'm just being honest about what I'm sitting with." She said, "I know the difference." He believed her. She said, "I have felt that thing for most of my adult life. The distance between the life that belongs to you and the life that is required of you." She paused. "The difference is that I felt it alone. You are telling me. That is not a small distinction." The snow on the mountain faces caught the early light and held it. He said, "I'm not going anywhere." She said, "I know." She looked at him. "That is why I trust you." They sat there until the light shifted and the settlement began its morning sounds around them. The first movements of people and animals, the smell of breakfast fires, the acoustic quality of a stone community waking up, and neither of them moved from the cold step, and the distance from Harrow's mill was real and present and did not require anything from either of them except acknowledgement. Then she stood, and he stood, and the day began. Haska told him he was becoming useful in the third week. She said it with her characteristic flat precision, without decoration. She had come to find him in the groundwalker's workroom on a Thursday afternoon when he was in the middle of a disagreement with Fern about optimal harvest windows for a slow recovery root species, and she had waited in the doorway until the disagreement reached a natural pause. Then she said, "Vora wants your opinion on the Aldwin situation." Wren looked up. He did not know what the Aldwin situation was. Haska said, "She'll explain. She has been asking your opinion on specific people since the second week. I thought you should know she has been using those opinions." She looked at him with the steady attention she brought to everything. "Not all of them, but most of them." He said, "Why are you telling me this?" She said, "Because you seem uncertain whether you are useful here." I thought the information was relevant. Then she turned and walked back toward the main hall. He stood in the doorway of the groundwalker's workroom for a moment, aware of Sophie watching him from the corner, with the openly interested expression of someone who had decided he was one of the more interesting developments in the settlement's recent history. He went to find Vora. He made mistakes. This was expected, and he had expected it, and nevertheless, each one required the internal work of a man who did not embarrass easily, but did embarrass, and who had to process each embarrassment honestly, without letting it become the story he told himself about why he did not belong. The formal dinner was the worst. 40 people, a significant occasion, the acknowledgement of a trade agreement with a settlement 2 ridges north. Wren had been briefed by Haska. He had paid careful attention. He had done everything correctly through 3 courses and 2 rounds of formal acknowledgments. Then came the toast. He had understood the structure. Call and response, a specific register of language, formal and elevated. He had understood the structure and prepared the correct words. What he had not prepared for was the way the room shifted in acoustic quality at the exact moment he needed to speak. And in the half-second of adjustment, he had reached for the words and retrieved them slightly wrong. Too casual. The register of ordinary speech in a moment that required the register of formal ceremony. The silence that followed had a very specific texture. Not anger, not contempt. The silence of 40 people simultaneously deciding how to react. Haska, 2 seats to his left, leaned in with a murmur so quiet it was essentially below audibility. She gave him the correct phrase. He repeated it. The moment passed. Forward into the next thing, which was also requiring attention. He lay awake that night going over it anyway. Vora came in without knocking. She had stopped doing that after the first week because knocking had started to feel like a formality they had moved past. She sat on the edge of the room's single chair and looked at him with the flat, accurate expression she used for true statements. She said, "I attended 40 formal occasions before I stopped making errors at them. I had been doing it since childhood. You have been doing it for 3 weeks." He said nothing. She said, "Go to sleep." He went to sleep. 6 months after they had walked out of the cottage in Harrow's Mill, into the thinning rain, the herb garden existed, not his technically. Nothing in Stonecrest was technically anyone's. Everything was clan land, managed communally, according to systems that had been developing for longer than any individual member's memory. But the strip of earth along the south wall of the inner settlement, which had been a storage area for lumber and was now organized according to a planning system that had emerged over 3 months of Thursday conversations with Fern and Sovey and mostly silent called, was as close to his as anything had been since the cottage. Fern had contributed the lunar timing framework adapted for the microclimate of the south wall. Sovey had contributed the species map, precise and color-coded, and already being updated as her understanding grew. Cald had contributed 3 weeks of work installing a drainage system that addressed the soil compaction issues Wren had identified in the first week, without being asked and without mentioning he intended to. Wren had contributed everything else. The beds were laid out along principles he had developed over 15 years in Appalachian terrain: the logic of adjacency, the management of shade and drainage, the careful separation of species whose chemical profiles would interfere with each other if they shared root space. He had found a patch of shadowroot growing wild on the north slope 2 months ago. It felt like being recognized. The mornings were his favorite part. Still up before dawn, old habit welded in by years of early starts on the ridge above Harrow's Mill. In the cold early light before Stonecrest woke fully, the garden was quiet and still, and smelled the way it always smelled: earth and green and cold air, and the faint trace of wood smoke from the overnight fires. He made his first round of the beds in the dark, moving by familiarity as much as sight. The shadow root was establishing. The black cohosh in the north bed had taken better than expected given the soil composition. The third bed, the experimental one, where he and Fern were trialing the lunar timing method on species that had previously been managed only by continuous harvest pressure, was showing the early indicators he had hoped for. He was kneeling beside the third bed, examining the soil moisture at root depth with 2 fingers, when he heard her footsteps on the stone path. Even now, 6 months in, he registered the sound, the weight distribution, the even pace, the way her movement through the early morning had become as familiar to him as his own. She came through the garden gate and he stood, and she held out a cup. She had learned to make his tea. He had not asked. He had not suggested. It had simply appeared one morning about 6 weeks in, a cup of tea offered, made with the plant combinations he kept on the shelf nearest the hearth, prepared in the order he prepared them. It was slightly too strong. She pulled the tea slightly hot, held it a few degrees longer than necessary, which pushed the tannins and created a bitterness at the back of the cup that his own preparation avoided by removing the herbs at exactly the right moment. He had never said anything. He would never say anything, because the slightly too strong tea she brought him each morning had, at some point between the first cup and now, stopped being a cup of tea that was slightly too strong and become something else entirely. Something that occupied a category that had not previously existed in his internal vocabulary, and that he was not interested in reducing to language. He took the cup. She fell into step beside him. They walked the settlement's boundary, her security route, established since childhood, now also their thinking time, the period before the obligations of the clan's governance arrived and required her full weight. She talked through the current complications, the Aldwin trade agreement and its renegotiation clause, the question of the northern settlement's winter allocation, the slowly rebuilding relationship with a neighboring clan whose leadership had shifted in the autumn. He listened and occasionally asked the kind of question that came not from understanding clan politics, but from understanding people, the substrate that all politics ran on, in which he had spent 29 years developing a specific fluency in. She had started, sometime in the second month, to ask his opinion on specific situations. Not to defer to them, she had her own judgment, sharp and earned over years, but to add a different angle. The angle of someone who could see the people involved without the accumulated history that colored how everyone inside the clan structure saw them. He was, Haska had told him, useful. He had accepted this as the significant thing it was. The morning it happened was in early winter. The frost had come overnight. The garden beds were silver-edged, the soil at the surface crunched underfoot. Above the settlement, the mountain ridges were fully white, the kind of white that arrived in November and stayed until April, And against the pale early sky, they had the quality of something permanent. Vora handed him the tea. He took it. Too strong, as always. He registered the warmth of the cup in his cold hands, with the gratitude of someone who had lived alone long enough to understand the full weight of a small, consistent gesture. They began the morning walk, she said without preamble. The council formalized us yesterday in the record. He looked at her. She was looking at the frost-edged garden beds as they passed. Her expression was doing the thing he had learned, over 6 months, to read with some accuracy. The composure fully present and functional, and underneath it something that had decided apparently not to entirely hide. He said, "What does that mean?" Formally. She said, "It means that in terms of the clan's structure, we are recorded as a household. Our decisions in the areas that matter are joint decisions. My standing extends to you and yours to me in the ways that tradition defines." She paused. Elder Gren proposed it. Isel seconded it. It passed without significant opposition. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I thought we'd been doing that anyway." She said, "We have." He said, "Then what changed?" She said, "The record caught up to what was already true." He thought about that. He thought about the cottage in Harrow's Mill, and the 3 days, and the morning on the ridge when she had stepped out of the trees and said 4 words that had taken everything he was and pointed it somewhere new. He thought about the square in the rain, and the 8 days of riding, and the cold rock under the mountain stars. He thought about 40 formal dinners, and Fern's initial suspicion, and called installing drainage without being asked, and Sovi's 4 pages of notes and the slightly too strong tea every morning for 6 months. He thought about the words she had used in the cottage doorway on the day he said yes, the one that didn't fully survive translation, the one whose weight the English equivalent couldn't carry. He had been learning the language for 6 months. He thought he understood the weight now. He said, "I want to ask you something, the thing you said you'd explain during the test." And then the test happened and it got somewhat lost in everything else. She glanced at him. He said, "The second morning, on the ridge before you came down, you said you'd been watching for 3 mornings. I know you told me at the end, in the cottage, but I've been thinking about it since and I want the full version." She was quiet for a long moment. The frost crackled softly underfoot. Above the settlement, a crow called once from somewhere along the white ridge line and went silent. She said, "The first morning I stopped because of the way you moved. I had been walking since before dawn and I was looking at the terrain, and then I was looking at you instead. The second morning I came back because I had not finished thinking about what I had seen." She paused. "On the second morning I watched you find a plant you needed. It was growing on a ledge near the eastern drop, the place where the limestone shelves out and the ground falls away on the north side." He remembered the place. She said, "You could have reached it. The drop was real, but the risk was not large. You had the skill to manage it. I watched you stand at the edge for a full minute. You assessed it, and then you walked away and found another patch further along the ridge that was safer and less convenient." He said nothing. She said, "Most people, when they can reach something they want, reach for it. The capacity to look at what you want and walk away from it because the risk to yourself is not worth it. That quality is rarer than people think, and it cannot be performed. It either exists or it doesn't." She looked at him directly. "I had spent years surrounded by people who reached for everything they could reach. I had forgotten the other thing was possible." She paused. "You reminded me." He thought about that morning on the ridge. He had not known he was being watched. He had simply stood at the edge and looked at the plant and the drop below it and made the calculation he always made. Is this worth it? And the answer had been no, and he had turned around and found another way. He said, "I didn't know you were watching." She said, "That was the point." The garden lay around them in the early frost, the beds he had built through the autumn, and the ones he would extend in spring, and the years of mornings that were beginning to accumulate the weight of a life that had been chosen rather than simply arrived at. The mountains were very white above them. The tea was slightly too strong and warm in his hands. Something old Marin had said on that last evening came back to him. Standing in the cold garden with the frost underfoot and the mountains over everything. 6 years I watched you spend your stamina on a life too small to need it. He understood now what she had seen. Not just the smallness of the life, the waste of a person capable of more than that life could hold. going through his careful, organized, adequate days. Not unhappy, not bitter, not broken, just unused. The way a good tool feels when it has been sitting in a drawer. He had been in the drawer for 6 years. He was not in the drawer anymore. He thought about patience, the kind that was not resignation and not waiting and not endurance, but something more active, the kind that was willing to walk away from what it could reach and move to safer ground. Not because it had given up on finding what it was looking for, but because it understood the difference between what you could take and what was worth having. He had spent 6 years in Harrow's Mill learning the difference. Some of those years he had not known that was what he was learning. Most of them, in fact. But learning does not require the learner to understand it is happening. It only requires the willingness to keep paying attention. He thought, standing in the frostlight, with the slightly too strong tea warm in his hands and the mountains white above everything, that the learning had been worth exactly what it cost. Both of them had paid for this in their own currency, over their own years, in ways that were not visible to anyone around them and did not require anyone to witness. They had earned it separately. Now they were spending it together. And the spending was its own kind of abundance, the richness of a life that had been difficult enough to mean something and chosen clearly enough to stay chosen, in the ordinary moments as well as the extraordinary ones, in the cold mornings as well as the formal evenings, in the quiet disagreements with ground walkers and the late nights working through the clan's complications, in the simple daily fact of two people who had looked at each other clearly and said yes. The silence between them was the silence of people who had nothing left to prove. They had earned that too. They walked on together along the frost-white garden in the early light, and the mountains held their ground above the settlement the way they always had, patient and indifferent and vast, asking nothing, offering everything to whoever paid close enough attention.